A young girl stood before the judge, her voice trembling with urgency. "Please, Your Honor, release my father. He's not a thief, and my mother and I are starving. We won't survive." These words, spoken by 12-year-old Sarah, sliced through the courtroom's tense air, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Her frail figure and tear-filled eyes begged the judge to listen to her plea. The room was motionless, the gravity of her situation palpable. Sarah's father, Thomas, sat handcuffed, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He was an honest man, wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. On the day of the robbery, he had merely been passing by the store, heading home after a long day's work. But due to his appearance and unfortunate timing, Thomas was mistaken for the culprit. The police arrested him on the street without questioning or hearing his side of the story, and now in court he was powerless, watching his daughter plead for his freedom. Sarah never imagined she'd have to face a courtroom, especially not like this, but necessity forced her hand. Since her father's arrest, their home had been enveloped in a devastating silence. Her mother, Linda, was gravely ill, unable to work or care for herself. Without Thomas, their already challenging life became unbearable. The food had run out days ago, and Sarah survived on scraps, picking up leftovers from bakery doorsteps. Her stomach growled every night, but the pain of watching her mother weaken was far worse. In the courtroom, Sarah's desperation was laid bare for all to see, yet no one seemed to care. The judge, a stern man named Robert, was used to cases like these, petty thefts and common crimes. To him, it was just another case, another poor family broken by life's hardships. But when Sarah spoke, something inside him stirred. Hunger, he had never known it as she described, not the gnawing emptiness she spoke of, which was not just a physical need but a cry for help from someone watching their life crumble. Sarah looked at her father with tear-filled eyes, knowing that if he were convicted, they would not survive. Thomas tried to remain strong, but the guilt of being unable to protect his family weighed heavily on him. "My dear daughter," he murmured, his words almost lost in the air. He had been wrongfully imprisoned, but the worst punishment was seeing his family suffer for something he hadn't done. His heart ached more for Sarah's hunger and Linda's illness than for the chains on his wrists. Linda, despite her weakness, tried to rise on the day of the trial but couldn't. Her body was too frail. Her daughter was her only hope. Sarah, though young, was the only one who could fight for her father's freedom and bring balance back to their home, ravaged by pain and poverty. But the thin, debilitated girl was up against a system that didn't care about stories like hers. "I know you think he's guilty, but he's not," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. She looked directly at Judge Robert, her courage surprising even the lawyers. "My father would never harm anyone. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. While he's locked up here, my mother and I are starving." Those words struck everyone present like a blow, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. The judge began to feel the weight of the situation. Robert had judged many cases, but why did this one feel different? He tried to maintain his characteristic composure, but the image of a thin, desperate child standing before him began to shake his convictions. Was the application of the law more important than saving a family from misery? Sarah then broke down in tears, her voice weakened by exhaustion and desperation. "Please, he just wants to come home. We just want to survive." Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was on her. Everyone in the courtroom could see that this fight was not just for her father's freedom. It was a battle for the entire family's survival, a fight against hunger, poverty, and the injustice that had cast a dark cloud over their lives. The days following Thomas's arrest were marked by painful silence in the small house where Sarah lived with her mother. Linda, already weakened by illness, completely lost her strength when she saw her husband taken away by the police. She could barely get out of bed, her pale skin and fragile body making every movement a struggle. The only sound in the house was Sarah's attempts to keep everything in order, even without knowing what to do. The silent, constant hunger became the family's only companion. The kitchen shelves, already sparse, were now completely empty. Sarah wandered the house with an empty stomach and a tired body, but couldn't stop. She knew that if she didn't do something, her mother wouldn't survive much longer. The only thing left in the house was a few crumbs of bread that Sarah saved for Linda. Even when hungry, she always left the little they had for her mother. With each bite Linda took, Sarah's stomach tightened, but her love for her mother spoke louder than her own hunger. Nights were the worst. In the dark, the silence weighed even more, interrupted only by the low rumblings of Sarah's empty stomach. The cold seeped through the poorly sealed window, and Sarah curled up in a corner, praying for her father's quick return. She didn't know how to fix the situation, but she knew she had to fight. With her father wrongfully imprisoned and her mother on the brink of death, she bore a responsibility greater than any child should have to endure. Linda tried to hold back tears in front of her daughter. Seeing Sarah, so small and fragile, taking on the role of caregiver broke her heart. She knew she was losing the battle against her illness but couldn't fight anymore. "I failed as a mother. I failed you, my daughter," Linda said weakly. Sarah, despite being hungry and exhausted, approached her mother, caressing her pale face. "No, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice firm despite the fatigue. "You haven't failed. Dad will come back, and I'll take care of you until then." But Sarah's words, spoken with courage, couldn't hide the fear she felt. She knew that without her father, survival was becoming impossible. With each passing day, her mother grew weaker, and nights were marked by anxiety and fear of waking up to find Linda lifeless. The girl no longer had the strength to cry. The tears that once came easily were now a constant knot in her throat, a sign that her body was getting used to deprivation. Amidst such despair, Sarah knew there was only one solution. She had to convince the judge to free her father. He was innocent. She knew it with all her heart. Thomas was in the wrong place at the wrong time, paying a steep price for it. But how could such a small girl change the decision of a man who had never met her and probably didn't care about her story? Even so, she had no choice. It was the only way. With the little courage she had left, Sarah decided that on the day of the final trial, she would speak to the judge. She didn't know what he would say, but she knew she had to try. She was determined to save her family, even if it meant facing the indifference of the court. Linda, weak in bed, tried to dissuade her. "It's dangerous. They won't listen to you. They are powerful men," she said. But Sarah was undeterred. "Mom, I have to try. I can't leave Dad there and you here like this. I'll talk to the judge. I'll tell him what we're going through." The fear in Sarah's heart was immense, but greater than fear was hunger, the pain of seeing her mother wasting away, and the longing for her father. She put on her simplest clothes and left the house, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. Each step she took towards the courthouse felt heavier than the last, but she kept going. There was no more time to falter. The only thing she could think was, if I don't speak for me and my mother, no one will. The path to the courthouse seemed endless to Sarah. Her small, bare, and wounded feet dragged along the dirt road as she tried to stay focused. Hunger throbbed in her stomach, but the desperation for justice propelled her. The image of her father being led away in handcuffs like a criminal was etched in her memory. The small town offered no help. Whispers of judgment followed Sarah wherever she went. But that day, she decided that others' words no longer mattered. She needed to speak for her family. Arriving at the courthouse, Sarah looked at the massive wooden doors and felt a wave of fear. Everything there seemed cold and distant, a place where people weren't heard, where only the law spoke. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of hunger and despair on her shoulders as she crossed the threshold. Her eyes found her father Thomas, sitting on the defendant's bench, head bowed and handcuffed. Sarah's heart clenched seeing him in such a vulnerable state, as fragile as her mother at home. The hearing was about to begin, and Judge Robert entered the room, serious and indifferent as always. He was a man known for strictly following the rules, unaffected by emotional stories. His rigid demeanor made it clear there would be no room for clemency. Sarah watched every move the judge made as he settled into his seat. She knew that this man held her family's fate in his hands. The prosecutor began presenting the facts, accusing Thomas of armed robbery. The explanation was cold and factual, making Thomas seem like a cruel criminal. Sarah wanted to scream, to interrupt, to say they were all wrong. Her father wasn't a thief. He had never done anything wrong. But no one seemed to care about what she had to say. To them, her voice was invisible, an insignificant noise amid the weight of the laws at play. "Mr. Thomas was caught in the act," the prosecutor said, his voice resonating through the room like a death sentence. "He was at the crime scene and therefore must pay for his actions." Sarah felt her heart race, her hands cold with sweat. She knew her father wasn't there to steal, but to catch the bus home after a day's work. Yet all of this seemed irrelevant to the adults around her. And then Sarah could no longer bear it. With a weak body and a trembling voice, she stood from where she was and, without asking for permission, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Please listen. My father is not a thief. He was coming home. My mother is sick, and we have nothing left to eat. We just need him back. The courtroom paused, Sarah's words cutting through the dense air. Judge Robert, with narrowed eyes, turned to look directly at the girl. Never before had a child dared to speak out like that, challenging the formality of the court. The silence that followed was heavy, as if time had stopped. All eyes were on her now, the small girl daring to interrupt a serious trial with a desperate plea. Who allowed this girl to speak? The judge grumbled, irritated as murmurs began to spread through the room. But Sarah didn't back down. She had nothing left to lose. With tears streaming down her thin face, she continued, her voice choked but firm. I'm hungry, Your Honor. My mother is too. If you don't release my father, we will die. Those last words were laden with such deep pain that the entire room felt the impact. It was impossible to ignore the harsh reality Sarah carried with her, the misery that had engulfed her family since her father's unjust imprisonment. Judge Robert blinked a few times, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with emotional cases, but something about Sarah's sincerity touched him deeply. The desperation in her eyes, the trembling voice carrying a truth no law could cover, began to thaw the ice within him. He looked around, seeing the shocked faces of the lawyers and the public. What was he supposed to do? The laws were clear, but at that moment, he began to question whether they were truly dispensing justice. The courtroom, still immersed in silence, seemed suspended in time by Sarah's desperate outburst. Judge Robert, always firm and impassive, struggled to control the torrent of emotions flooding his mind. He had built his career believing that the law was unquestionable, that justice could only be served through the cold and direct application of the rules. But Sarah's words echoed in his head. We are hungry. My mother is sick, and that raw truth hit him like a blow to the chest. Robert observed the little girl before him, thin, her eyes tired and marked by sadness. She wasn't just a child pleading for mercy. She was the living embodiment of a life devastated by injustice and poverty. Her trembling lips and voice, laden with despair, told a story far beyond the laws he had followed all his life. For the first time, Robert felt the weight of a decision that went beyond a common verdict. He wasn't just judging a crime, but deciding the fate of an entire family. For a few moments, Robert looked away from Sarah and focused on Thomas, the wrongfully accused father. Thomas, with his head lowered, stared at the floor, unable to meet his daughter's gaze, as if guilt and shame for his powerlessness crushed him. He knew that at that moment, Sarah was doing for him what he couldn't do, fighting for the family. Robert saw the pain in Thomas's face, a simple man with calloused hands from hard work, a father who had been torn from his home without any real proof of his guilt. The weight of the situation grew heavier on Robert by the second. The family's hunger, illness, and despair weren't mere emotional arguments. They were cruel and inescapable facts. But he knew the system demanded more than a sad story. The law was clear. Robbery was a crime. But Thomas wasn't guilty. Robert knew that now. Sarah had brought forth not just the case, but the humanity hidden behind the cold pages of justice. As a judge, Robert always believed that impartiality was the key to a fair decision. But at that moment, he felt that impartiality was a luxury reality could no longer afford. The conflict in his mind intensified. The laws had to be followed, but the reality of that family shattered all his certainties about what was just. Robert had always known the system was harsh, but he had never been confronted with the direct consequences of that harshness so brutally. What to do when following the law meant condemning a family to hunger and slow death. Robert recalled his own childhood, his mother always ensuring there was never anything missing at the table, even in the hardest times. He had never gone hungry, never had to watch someone he loved waste away for lack of food. But there before Sarah, he saw for the first time what hunger truly did to a person, to a family. Hunger wasn't just physical. It destroyed hope, corroded the soul. Sarah wasn't pleading for mercy just for her father, but for her own future and her mother's. And now Robert was at the center of this decision. The judge took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, but the image of Sarah, so young, facing an entire courtroom with nothing but the truth, began to overshadow the pages of the legal codes he had studied all his life. He knew his decision would have repercussions and would challenge everything he had always believed to be just. The pressure on him was immense, but Sarah's words, "We will die of hunger," wouldn't leave him in peace. Robert looked around the room, seeking something to help him reconnect with the coldness of the law, but he only saw faces impacted by the pain Sarah had exposed. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes, waiting to see what his choice would be. The words of the law said that Thomas should remain in prison until the investigations were concluded, but Robert's heart knew that if he followed this logic, he would be destroying innocent lives. The courtroom was charged with a tension almost palpable. Despite her fragility, Sarah stood before the tribunal, fighting against the hunger that tightened her stomach and the fear that hammered her heart. The courage that brought her there was on the verge of crumbling, but she knew that if she didn't speak now, her family would be lost. The weight of her voice was the only hope left. Judge Robert's gaze was fixed on her, but Sarah didn't let herself be intimidated. There was more at stake than her own vulnerability. It was her mother's life and her father's freedom. With a trembling voice but full of determination, Sarah stepped forward. "Your Honor, I know you're here to do what's right, but what's happening to us isn't right." The words came out laden with emotion, each sentence an effort to hold back the tears threatening to fall. "My father is not a thief, he never was. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." The silence that enveloped the room was overwhelming. Sarah wasn't just fighting against the indifference of the court, but against time, which seemed to be running against her family. Sarah continued, her voice firmer now, but the desperation still present. "Since my father was arrested, my mother can't get up anymore," she said, her eyes filled with a sadness few would understand. "She's sick, and I can't do anything for her. There's no food at home, Your Honor. We have nothing. I just want you to know that if my father stays in prison, we will die, not all at once, but slowly, first from hunger, then from sadness." Sarah's words pierced the room. No one could look away from the small girl facing justice with such disarming sincerity that even the hardest hearts present felt the pain she carried. The audience, who had until then observed the scene with a certain detachment, now saw the full picture. A child fighting for her family, a family destroyed by poverty, and an injustice that the laws couldn't remedy. Judge Robert, despite trying to maintain his composure, felt the weight of those words deeply affecting him. He had spent years judging cases, deciding fates based on what was written in the law books. But now, before that child, he began to realize that not everything was in the books. Sarah wasn't there to appeal to his mercy. She wasn't asking for the law to be broken out of compassion. She was simply speaking the truth, a truth that no one in the courtroom could deny. "I know you think my father is guilty," she continued, unable to hold back the tears that now flowed freely down her face. "But he's not, and while he's here, I'm at home alone with my mother, with nothing to eat. I try to take care of her, but I'm just a child. What can I do, Your Honor? I need him back. We need him." The entire room was immersed in Sarah's pain, each of her words a stab in the hearts of those who listened. The lawyers, previously engaged in their legal discussions, now seemed more silent, as if reflecting on the impact of the situation before them. The weight of the hunger and misery Sarah described was no longer a distant reality, but something everyone there could feel in the air. Even the judge, so accustomed to judging according to the law, seemed to struggle with the raw and honest truth Sarah brought to light. Looking at her father, Sarah saw the pain in his eyes. Thomas, even in prison, tried to find strength to comfort his daughter, but he knew he couldn't do anything. The injustice weighed on him like an unbreakable chain, and his daughter, who should have been playing and studying, was there pleading for her family's life. "Dad," Sarah whispered, but her voice failed. He just looked at her with tears in his eyes, knowing that her words carried all the truth needed for him to be exonerated. "Your Honor," Sarah said, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her blouse as she tried to maintain her composure, "I don't know what else to say. I just wanted you to understand that we're fighting to survive. My father's imprisonment is destroying us. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for justice." The courtroom was filled with a dense silence, Sarah's words still echoing through the room. Her sincere and painful outburst hung in the air like a truth no one could ignore. Judge Robert, usually relentless, was immersed in a dilemma he had never faced with such depth. He had always prided himself on applying the law firmly, strictly following what was written in the codes, without ever letting his decisions be influenced. But now, before that girl who pleaded not for mercy but for justice, something inside him was breaking apart. Looking at Sarah, Robert saw more than just a frail and hungry girl. He saw the embodiment of a society that so often ignored hunger, despair, and the struggle for survival. All of this was before him, and there was no way to look away. He wondered how many times in the past he had given sentences that, even based on the law, failed to consider the human impact. How many families could he have destroyed with his decisions? The entire room awaited his response. The lawyers, the public, and especially Sarah, all had their eyes fixed on him, waiting for a verdict. Robert's heart raced. What should he do? The law said one thing, but his heart said another. For the first time, he found himself torn between what was legally correct and what was morally necessary. Sarah, still standing, looked at the judge with eyes swollen with tears, but there was something more in her expression, hope. She had the conviction that the man before her could make a difference, that he could restore dignity to her family. Hunger didn't wait for bureaucracy, and her mother didn't have time for the system to resolve itself. Sarah needed an answer, and she needed it now. Robert cleared his throat, trying to organize his thoughts. He knew he was about to make a decision that would be questioned by many, but at that moment, he understood that true justice wasn't just a matter of blindly following the rules. It needed to be human. He looked at the defendant, Thomas, a man with a defeated look who should never have been imprisoned. Robert felt the injustice of the system weighing on him like a stone. The error was clear, and keeping him in prison would solve nothing, only prolong the suffering of a family already in ruins. Silence in the courtroom, Robert said with a firm voice, but now laden with a different gravity. Everyone stopped, the air caught in the lungs of those present. The entire room awaited the verdict, but no one could predict what was to come. Robert leaned forward, looking directly at Sarah. Sarah, he began, surprising everyone by addressing the girl directly. What you said here today touched all of us. The truth you brought to light is something this court cannot ignore. Sarah's heart raced. The judge's words were different from anything she expected. He wasn't ignoring her. He had heard. Finally, someone had heard. Robert then turned to Thomas, Sarah's father, and continued, "The court recognizes that a mistake was made. Thomas, you were wrongfully imprisoned, and for that, this court decides that you must be released immediately." The room erupted in murmurs of surprise. No one expected that, and Sarah could hardly believe what she had heard. Her father would be freed. Thomas, still stunned, looked at the judge, unable to find the right words. Sarah ran to him, tears streaming down her thin face, and hugged him with all the strength her small body allowed. She felt as if the nightmare was finally ending. But Robert didn't stop there. His decision went beyond freeing Thomas. He knew that simply releasing the man wouldn't be enough to repair what this family had suffered. Furthermore, he continued, "I will refer this case to social services to ensure that your family receives the necessary support. You need more than justice. You need help to start over." The tears Sarah had held back for so long now fell freely, but this time they were tears of relief. Finally, someone was willing to do something. Finally, there was hope that her mother would receive the care she needed, that hunger would no longer be a ghost in their lives. Everyone was in shock. Judge Robert's decision wasn't just about freeing an innocent man. It was acknowledgement that justice must also be based on humanity. For many there, it represented an unexpected and surprising change in the behavior of a man known for his coldness. Thomas was released, and his family's future seemed to be changing for the better. But what would happen next for Judge Robert? He had challenged his own beliefs and the system he had sworn to uphold. Would he face consequences for choosing compassion over the cold law? After Judge Robert's decision, the courtroom was in absolute silence, except for Sarah's quiet sobs as she continued to embrace her father, Thomas, as if she would never let go. The pain and suffering that family had endured were slowly dissipating, but the weight of reality was still felt. The little girl who had entered the courtroom with fear now left with her head held high, knowing that her courage and determination had saved her family from an even greater tragedy. As Thomas and Sarah left the courtroom, Judge Robert remained seated, reflecting on the impact of that hearing. He had broken the rules he had followed all his life. For the first time, he chose to see beyond the written laws, beyond the coldness of the system, and saw the humanity behind the stories he often ignored. He had freed an innocent man, and in doing so, he had also freed himself from the chains of a blind justice that didn't consider the suffering of the people who depended on it. Robert knew that by making this choice, he was opening the door to criticism. His fellow judges, the lawyers, and society itself would question his decision. But deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. There was something more important than blindly following the letter of the law. He had learned that in some cases, justice needs compassion to be complete, and Sarah had shown him that clearly by exposing her pain, her hunger, and her family's desperate struggle. Outside, Sarah looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath of fresh air for the first time in a long time. She felt that things could get better. Her father was back, and her mother would now have the support she desperately needed. She had won, not with shouts or violence, but with her truth. The little girl had managed to move a mountain. As they left the courthouse, Robert approached Sarah. He crouched down to her level and with a gentle smile on his face said, "You were very brave today. Remember that for the rest of your life. Never be afraid to fight for what's right." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She knew that Judge Robert had done the impossible. He had heard her plea, and it had saved her family. Conclusion and CTA, Robert's decision showed that even the most rigid can be transformed by truth and humanity. Sarah and her family got a new chance, not just because of the laws, but because someone chose to see the heart of the situation. If you were moved by this story of overcoming injustice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Here we share stories that touch deeply and make you reflect on what is truly important. Now I want to hear from you. Comment justice with heart if you believe Judge Robert made the right choice by prioritizing compassion and humanity or just the law. If you think he should have followed the rules strictly, I'm curious to know your opinion and we'll give a heart to everyone who participates.